All right, football at 4. Johnny Mac's in the house. What's going on, everybody? Mike and Ryan taking you the rest of the way. As we do every day at this time, football at 4, we look at all the Eagles and NFL news and notes, and there was a lot today to dive into. Don't forget, coming up, we got pairs of tickets to the fight this weekend at Ocean Casino Resort as championship boxing comes back to Atlantic City. Shields is in. Now, Clarissa Shields, who fought at Boardwalk Hall last year, is back in action again. This is the fight that a lot of people are highly anticipating. So we've got tickets to that fight for Friday night. It's Friday night. And we'll do those throughout between now and the end of the show. But it was almost like a fight between Doug Pederson, Howie Roseman, and the media today regarding something big. Let's bring John McMullen into the conversation. He was there. And now, John, it seems like the Eagles are doing a little damage control on this Jim Schwartz stuff. As the story goes, Mike Groh and Carson Walsh were both kind of given a stamp of approval that they definitively would be back. When asked about Schwartz, it seemed like there was a couple of jumping jacks and stuff that Pederson was going through. In fact, at one point, I thought it was interesting that Roseman said, "I'll let the coach talk about the coaches." He didn't even want to comment on it. And then they were followed up about Schwartz. And now, about 10 minutes ago, tweets are coming out from some of the national guys that, hey, they have no intention of getting rid of Schwartz. So I'll let you kind of give your feeling on this whole Jim Schwartz thing that kind of opened up today.
Yeah, a lot of ambiguity. Doug was very vague about it, which set it off because, as you mentioned, when he asked about Mike Groh, who you would think would be in more trouble, in theory, certainly fans think that. Carson Walsh, a guy who just about everybody thinks would be in trouble. He said, no, they'll be back. And with Jim, he wouldn't say it. He would not say it. And he's out in Cleveland today interviewing for the head coaching job. And if he gets that, it's not really an issue, obviously. But from most people in the league, the Browns are going to lean offensive in either Josh McDaniels or Kevin Stefanski. And then you have a question of Jim coming back here. He's under contract through 2020, so he should come back. We've talked a lot about the personality, and I've mentioned if there is going to be a disconnect, it's going to involve that personality and people getting along. And I don't know if they're at that point, but I got to tell you, you mentioned the national reporters coming out. Obviously, the Eagles are doing some damage control. It's pretty simple to say, I think Jim deserves to be a head coach in this league. And I think he should get the Cleveland Browns job. If not, he's under contract here. That's pretty simple. It's pretty easy to do. So the fact they wouldn't do that tells you maybe it's not a full-blown fire, but there's some smoke there.
Well, not only that, he was asked about two other coaches, and he gave a definitive answer. Like, if he just did the Schwartz thing, okay, maybe. But he was asked about two other coaches, and he said, yes, they will be back.
Yeah, exactly. He said Mike Groh and two other coaches who, in theory, would be in more trouble than Jim Schwartz from just a job performance perspective. And he had no problem saying they were coming back. And all of a sudden you have Jim Schwartz, who's a top 10 defense without a top 10 level talent base. He wouldn't go that far. So you can blame the media if you want. People love to do that. But as I said, it's pretty easy to go through that and say what you want to say. If what Ian Rappaport is saying now, and the Eagles love him and they want him back, if he doesn't get the Cleveland job, they hope he gets the Cleveland job. Again, pretty easy to go up there and say, I think Jim deserves to be head coach in this league, but he's under contract through 2020. If he doesn't get a head coaching job, he's going to be my defensive coordinator. Pretty easy to do that. Eagles did not do that.
Yeah, the question Jeff McLean asked, will Coach Groh and Coach Walsh be back, though? Doug Pederson, yes, both those guys will be back. Later on, the back and forth about Schwartz was a little different. Not a yes, he will be back. But I want to ask you, how realistic of a candidate do you think Schwartz is? Because I think a lot of people just feel like, Schwartz, but now there's some stuff coming out that they liked him a couple of years ago. They like his analytics. They think he's a smart guy. So do we feel that he is more of a legitimate candidate for the Browns job than maybe when this first came out we thought?
Well, if you get in the building, there's always an opportunity to hit a home run, and he's in the building today. People in Cleveland say they're going to finish this process, and they have Stefanski scheduled, I believe, tomorrow. McDaniels would be last on Friday. Jim Schwartz, Joe Banner always says first is good, last is good. When you're doing a head coaching search, last would be McDaniels. First would have been Mike McCarthy. They can't hire him. He got the Dallas job. So Jim's in the middle. If you read those typical tea leaves, that means he's not number one on the list. But, again, you can always change that. And there are also people in this league that believe that the Browns are trying to pull off a twofer here and trying to get Josh McDaniels as the head coach and Jim Schwartz as the defensive coordinator. That would be the key because the Eagles could block that. And obviously if they don't block that, they didn't want him back.
John, is there a possibility, just trying to figure out what the reason would be, and you touched on it briefly, but what the reason would be for Schwartz not being the defensive coordinator here if he doesn't get another job? And obviously it's not really going to be performance-based, but we were throwing ideas back and forth earlier. Do you think it could be Howie and the organization want a different path for personnel decisions on the defensive side of the ball, and maybe Jim Schwartz, they draft a certain way or build the roster a certain way on that side when he's the DC? What could be the reason?
No, it would be strictly personality driven, and they just want to go in a different direction from that standpoint. And there's some butting of heads inside the organization. He's a big personality guy. We've talked about it a lot. Kind of commands a room, kind of acts like a head coach, but isn't a head coach, and that can rub some people the wrong way occasionally. Always go back to the Mike Lombardi thing. He's always been connected to that. People speculated he was the one feeding Mike information early in Doug's tenure here. Don't know if that's fair or not, but it's out there. So I think it would be strictly personality driven. It's got nothing to do with job performance. It's got nothing to do with personnel. Howie Roseman is in control of personnel. Does he defer? All general managers should defer to the coaching staff. And by defer, I mean, if they want a guy, I'm not saying you go out and get the guy, but when you have, whether it's the offensive side or the defensive side of the ball, you want to engage those coaches in conversation and get the types of players that they want. You want to get the traits that they want. So I'm not saying Jim doesn't have a big part of the personnel aspect of it on defense, because he does. But Andrew Sendejo being the perfect example, he would not have been cut if it were up to Jim Schwartz. Howie Roseman made that decision because the Eagles at sort of that deadline to get a potential compensatory pick, they weren't as good as they thought they were going to be. And Howie made the decision at the time, I'd rather have the future fourth-round pick than Andrew Sendejo. Jim wanted Andrew Sendejo. So it's not like he's putting his foot down. That's Howie Roseman's job.
Yeah. And, obviously this is the lead story today with Schwartz interviewing in Cleveland for the Cleveland Browns head coaching job, and then the presser where things seem to have went south for Doug Pederson answering those questions. But what were some other big takeaways for you from today's press conference?
Well, the biggest takeaway for me was Howie acknowledging essentially they felt that the window was open, 2017 to 2019, and they were going for it. And they were bringing in veteran players. They were leaning on veteran players. And now we're shifting into sort of a new era. And he acknowledged that they need to get younger, they need to get more speed, and they need to have an influx of those types of players on this team. So I don't know if everybody picked up on that, but that was pretty clear.
Oh yeah, I definitely heard him
yeah.
say that between 17 and 19, they were they made trades to try to get better, and they lost draft picks because of it. And now, he referenced multiple times they need an infusion of youth, and that they have all these draft choices. So I don't know, what are they rebuilding now?
Well, that's the thing. Certainly, and they never got to me with the microphone. That was my question. If I ever got the damn microphone, was going to be Howie. Is this a different phase? You mentioned one. Is this rebuilding? He would have never admitted that, of course, but you get sort of the feel for what this organization is feeling, and it's different. And they're about to embark on a different type of off season, and it's not going to be relying on proven veteran players as opposed to young players. They kind of know they have to rebuild, certainly at the very least, the back end of this roster.
Johnny Mac, football at 4. Eagles had their end of the season press conference today, and there was a lot to kind of unpack from this. The Jim Schwartz stuff kind of stood out, I think, among everything because he is interviewing today with the Cleveland Browns. But some more takeaways from the presser today, which was, number one, the fact that the Eagles here have had a lot of injuries. And Roseman kind of mentioned that, the last 2 years the injuries have really hurt us. He then mentioned that they hired a medical chief officer who kind of oversaw everything after they, that whole thing was a little bizarre too. Like, when did this all happen?
It happened in June. They announced it. They hired a new chief medical officer. But Howie kind of explained it today. He was brought in, and the plan was that he was going to observe this season and then give recommendations. So he wasn't actively involved in making changes during the season. In theory, he will be actively involved in making changes from this point forward. But I'm pretty consistent on this. Injuries, and Howie also admitted, look, if you're older in pro football, just like in life, and he referenced himself, my body doesn't feel the same as it did 10 years ago. That's just common sense. If you have more older players, you're more susceptible to injury. And that's just part of it. Mm-hmm. Other parts are bad luck. Carson Wentz's concussion. And by the way, I give Doug Pederson tremendous credit for trying to move on from that nonsense. And then I think the part of it is the messaging. I firmly can say it's not the medical staff, it's the messaging. So if people are looking for changes on how to handle hamstrings, or they're not coming. Everybody handles hamstrings the same way. These are all high-level doctors, whether it's in Philadelphia or New York or Cleveland or Los Angeles or anyone else. Nobody has the magic formula to handle a hamstring. They all do the same thing.
Yeah, that's not really going to go away, I think, especially with the NFL going farther away from practicing more and, how much they're in the building in the off season. And I think that all plays a role. But going back to the point where, Howie said that they're looking to get younger and they're excited to have 10 draft picks. Is that saying without saying that Jason Peters won't be back and possibly Malcolm Jenkins won't be back? The big names, John, that we've been discussing that are older.
Yeah, I think there's a possibility, more so for Jason Peters than Malcolm Jenkins. But I think it's all a case-by-case scenario. And Howie also mentioned, it does have to be a mix. You do have to have some veteran leadership. You can't play all rookies and first-year players who don't know what the heck they're doing. So I think it's got to be a better balance, and I think he used that exact word. They need a better balance. That doesn't mean you're not going to have veteran players. You need veteran players. You just can't have the influx that they have. And then the second part, and Howie was pretty honest about this, is and he even said he gets too attached to his players. And that's one of his weak points and one of his weaknesses. And you bring back the Jordan Matthews of the world and the Jay Ajahis who have nothing left. They got to move on from that type of thinking as well.
Yeah, John, and we know that the other thing that was there's a lot of things that were brought up, but another one was Alshon Jeffrey. Now, on the Alshon front, he talked about why he redid that deal, because there's a lot of people saying, well, why did you do that after he seemingly is slowing down? And he also, the way he made it out, however, was he sounded to me like he was a huge Alshon guy, in the fact that he said, he loves playing here. He loves this city. He loves it all. Don't forget all the things that he did. So I don't know. It for those of people who thought that Alshon wouldn't be back, it didn't sound like Howie was on that same page.
Well, he loves him because to get rid of him would cost him $26 million. And Howie's not known for liking much dead cap, never mind $26 million for one player. So it's going to be very difficult for the Eagles to move on. They can, and you can move on from any player, but that's some significant medicine to take. That is a big, big dead cap number that very rarely any team would take that on. There's a possibility. Remember, he's hurt, so can't trade him. Nobody's going to want to trade him at those types of numbers, especially coming off the injury. And then you could just pay him to sit and stay away and rehab. I mean, you got to pay him anyway. You guaranteed the money. And then you can move on in a much more logical manner next year when the salary cap hit is much less. But for the Eagles to move on from Alshon Jeffrey, it cost them $26 million on the cap next year. I don't know how they can do that. I certainly know that Howie doesn't want to do that. Doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be a big part of this team next year.
John, so in your mind, or if you had to guess here, where do the dominoes fall as far as personnel decisions in the offseason? Because we just went through a lot of them, and there's a lot more that we haven't even touched on. I mean, you have Alshon Jeffrey, Jason Peters, Jenkins, the whole secondary, and the long list of questions surrounding them. So does it start in the draft? Does it start in free agency? Where does this begin if you're Howie and Doug?
Well, I think it's more the draft than free agency, and that's a bit of a change and a bit of a shift that he talked about. I mean, this team had 5 draft choices for 2 years in a row. That's the lowest in the NFL, and that's not only the lowest in the NFL by a significant margin. I mean, there are certain guys and certain GMs in this league and that's the number, and that's what the Eagles have. They start with 10, and they want more, and they end up with 12 or 13. And the reason why is because despite what you'll see on Twitter over the next number of months where everybody thinks they are an expert, it's not an exact science. And the more volume of picks you have, the more likely you are to get good players. And when you do get good players, people tend to forget about the misses. And that's why if you want 13 or 14 picks and you end up with 14 picks and 7 of them turn out to be great players, well, everybody forgets about the other 7. That's where the Eagles need to go. That's how they're going to go. It's going to be more draft-centric than free agency-centric, and that's the difference between 2017 and 2019 as he was talking, and now it's going to be different moving forward, and it needs to be different. But one other thing that is a little bit lost in this is the Eagles are going to make personnel moves. Howie kind of dropped that bomb, personnel department move shortly over the next couple days. Names are coming out, Connor Barwin and Brett Selleck. Now, just think about what Howie said about getting too attached to his guys. Mm-hmm. And he's bringing in Connor Barwin to the personnel department. I don't understand this organization at times.
I also thought this was kind of interesting in that Howie said that, I mean, it was almost like they were almost admitting that, hey, we go right off the stat sheet to scout our players, because he mentioned that, hey, there are
that was a Joe Douglas dig.
Yeah, well, that there are 3 rookie receivers who never had more than 40 catches in a college season who have been productive. So essentially you're like, well, if you didn't have a good college production, we weren't really interested in you.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you guys pay attention to my segments, but I predicted this months ago. You're going to hear this because that was Joe Douglas's mentality. In that college production was a big thing, and I said, wait till Howie gets the draft season. He's going to throw Joe under the bus, and he did it today. And it was one of the most predictable things you're ever going to see. Look, there are tons of productive college players that become productive pro players, and there are some players who aren't productive in college that turn into good pros. There's no exact science to this. But I knew how he was going to blame that on Joe Douglas. I'll just say that.
All right. For more takeaways on the post-season press conference, check out our website, 973ESPN.com. John McMullen was there. He breaks it all down, all the highlights of it and more. You can check that out at 973ESPN.com. Anything in closing that we may have missed? Because, I mean, there was 35 minutes of stuff there today.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff. I'm trying to think. I'm glad we got to the Joe Douglas stuff. We got to the personnel. I think it's going to be Connor Barwin, potentially Brett Selleck, added to the personnel department. They said they were excited about that. They shouldn't be. You shouldn't be excited about that. And the coaching staff. Obviously, the biggest story today, is definitely Jim Schwartz by a wide margin.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll keep our eye on Schwartz and see if he ends up getting the job. Apparently, the reports out in Cleveland is they want to get this done by the weekend, and that would be the last head coaching job there. Let me ask you this: if someone else gets that job, is there a potential that they would hire Jim Schwartz to be their coordinator in Cleveland?
Well, yeah, that was the rumor going around the NFL. Was that they want, in essence, a twosome of Josh McDaniels and Jim Schwartz as the defensive coordinator. That is where this all started. And for that to happen, Jim cannot leave the Eagles for a lateral move. He cannot leave the Eagles for a defensive coordinator position.
Now, do you think they'd let him?
The only way that can happen is if the Eagles let him.
Right.
And obviously, if the Eagles let him, they don't want him.
Mm-hmm. All right, we'll keep our eyes on that and everything else in the NFL. We'll start to get into the games a little. By the way, Vinny Curry was on earlier. I don't know if you saw any of my tweets on this, but I thought one of the more interesting things from Curry was he was definitive in that Doug Pederson takes no SHI, and he spelled it out for us. Like, basically saying, look, you guys don't understand. This guy don't take from nobody. Like
including coaches.
Yeah, like nobody. Like, basically painting a different picture of who Pederson is behind closed doors.
No, yeah, there's no question. There's two Dougs. I've seen Angry Doug up close, and Doug's a big guy. Yeah, Vinny's right. He doesn't take any, what. So there is, I think, a natural assumption because most of the time he's a good-natured guy. You saw him today. You probably see that water bottle video going around. He was acting goofy today. He was happy Doug. But I've seen angry Doug. Yeah, he's not – he can get in bad moods, and he will tell you what he thinks. And when the hammer needs to come down, he's got no problem doing it.
All right, John McMullen, all guests appear via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. He's back tomorrow with another edition of Football at 4. Thanks, pal.
All right, thanks.